You are that man. Bill Maher, in an episode of his TV show on CNN that he did a few weeks ago, made what I thought was an absolutely brilliant point. He talked about how while those on the extreme right want to deny January 6th, those on the extreme left want to deny October 7th. And then he went on to share his frustration, his consternation, his disgust at the fact that people on both sides can look at the other side and point the finger and see so clearly how their position, the opposite position, is utterly indefensible, how they have to do mental gymnastics to try to defend it, to rationalize it. And yet they can't see that they're doing the very same thing themselves in defending the position that they take on their side of the extreme. And then he observed that all of this is due to the fact that people have these irrational commitments to their partisan orthodoxy. And that's what drives what he calls this insanity. His anecdote, and this is where I'm totally with him. I don't always agree with him on every point he makes, but I'm totally with him on this. His antidote to this rampant hypocrisy is that we think critically, that we think independently, that we remain open-minded, that we follow the science, follow the data, the real facts, not the alternative facts. You are the man. There's a great story in the Bible, 2 Samuel chapter 12, where the prophet Nathan comes up to David, the great King David, the man after God's own heart, who, oh, by the way, at this point when Nathan comes up to him, has just committed adultery. Actually, it's a lot worse. He really rapes Bathsheba because as king, she can't say no to him. She wouldn't dare do so. So he really rapes Bathsheba, who happens to be married to Uriah the Hittite, one of David's troops. And then to cover it up, because David finds out she's pregnant, he goes through this whole series of events trying to get Uriah to have relations with his wife so that he'll think the child is his. But when all that fails, David puts him out on the front line and gives orders to his commanders to, in the heat of the battle, to withdraw and leave him out there hung out to dry so that he'll die. So effectively, David has murdered Uriah. He's raped Bathsheba and now murdered her husband. And then he takes Bathsheba in as his wife and is about to raise this son as if nothing happened, as if there was nothing untoward about how this son came to be. In other words, he's kind of like going on with life as normal, completely blind to the horror of the things that he has done. That's when Nathan comes up to him and tells him this parable. He says, David, there was a rich man who had many cattle and many sheep. And then there was this poor man who had this one little ewe lamb, a female lamb. And this ewe lamb, female lamb, was so precious to him and his family that she became like a daughter to him. She would actually sit at the table when they would eat dinner together. One day, a stranger comes into town, and back in those days, it was customary to show strangers hospitality. So the rich man shows him the ancient standard of that customary hospitality by throwing this big party, this celebration, having a feast for him, dropping everything to throw a feast for this stranger. But instead of taking one of his cattle or sheep to slaughter, he takes the little ewe lamb, the one and only lamb that this poor man has, and slaughters her for the feast. At this point, David's blood is boiling. He's irate. He turns to Nathan and he says, that man must die for what he did. To which Nathan turns to David and says, David, you are that man. And in that moment, David's blindness falls, the scales fall from his face, and he sees clearly the horror of what he has done in committing rape and murdering Uriah, committing rape with raping Bathsheba and murdering Uriah. He sees the full horror of what he's done, and he repents and turns back towards God. You are that man. In another recent episode, actually since the one I mentioned at the beginning of this video that Bill Maher was doing, he had an evangelical journalist on. And during the interview, he was talking to him about some things that this journalist had been saying, been very outspoken about in terms of what he saw as the all too cozy relationship, and in some ways dangerous and harmful relationship between evangelicals and former President Trump, their support of him. And because Bill Maher tends to, and has been very outspoken in his support of Vice President Harris and has some real concerns about former President Trump, Bill Maher was eating up everything this evangelical journalist was saying. He was peppering him with questions and kind of affirming all his answers, getting very excited about how this evangelical could kind of stand outside his own tradition, think in an open-minded, independent, critically thinking way about what's going on. He loved his analysis. Towards the end of the interview, though, Bill Maher couldn't help himself. He had to ask him one more question, press him on one more point. He turned to him and he looked at him and he said, "You appear to be a highly intelligent man. I mean, given your answers, your analysis, you clearly are an independent, open-minded, critical thinker. So how is it that you, being so intelligent, could believe in this Jesus stuff?" If you've watched Bill Maher before, you know that he often talks about his upbringing as a Catholic, how as a young kid he kind of drank the Kool-Aid of Catholicism and blindly believed it. But as he grew, as he matured, it didn't take long for him to reject it all as complete and utter nonsense. He thinks of the story of Jesus in the Gospels as mostly mythology. In fact, he made a point of pressing that with this journalist and saying, how can you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin or that he rose bodily from the dead? Bill Maher believes that anybody with half a brain can't believe that stuff because it's clearly, in his mind, pure mythology, legendary material. Bill Maher went on, before he gave the journalist a chance to answer, Bill Maher went on to talk about how he admires much of what Jesus taught, but he prefers the perspective of somebody like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, if you don't know, wrote his own gospel, his own Bible. What he basically did was he cut out all the miraculous parts, the supernatural parts, and just left Jesus' teaching. And for Bill Maher, that seems reasonable. There's a lot that's worthy in what Jesus taught that, in terms of his modern values, he agrees with and thinks are all too sorely lacking in our modern world. So Bill Maher loves a lot of what Jesus taught, but he thinks it's clear that the miraculous part of that record, the gospel record, is mythology. And so he pressed this evangelical journalist with that question: how can you, an intelligent person, clearly with half a brain, believe in this stuff? The journalist kind of smiled. He was amused. He's like, I can understand why you would have this question. But then he went on to assure him that it wasn't because of any kind of blind orthodoxy to Christian dogma that he felt. The reason that he believes in all this Jesus stuff, the journalist said, is because I am an open-minded, critical thinker. That's what led me to see the evidence that this is true, even the legendary elements of it. And then the journalist began, he just got to the very beginning of kind of constructing what is pretty complex but a tight argument, where he could show Bill Maher some of that evidence, show him what modern critical biblical scholars are talking about these days. But Bill Maher would hear none of it. He didn't show any curiosity in what this evangelical journalist had to say about that. He brought the interview to a quick end and basically said, yeah, well, and went on to something else. He was completely closed-minded about hearing the evidence. But this evangelical journalist was spot on when he's talking about the evidence that modern critical biblical scholars have unearthed for some of the most quote-unquote legendary or mythological parts of the Gospels, as Bill Maher would see it. Like, in particular, the miracles of Jesus. There is almost unanimous agreement now among modern critical biblical scholars, whether they believe in Jesus or not, that Jesus' contemporaries, both friend and foe, so his enemies as well, believed that when they were witnessing his ministry, they were witnessing miraculous power at work, supernatural power at work, even though his enemies would explain it as being from the power of Satan, of Beelzebul, of the devil. They all agreed that he was doing these supernatural feats. They couldn't deny it. That's the historical record. That's what modern biblical critical scholarship, the experts who devote their lives to this stuff, who are as critical thinking as anybody, open-minded as anybody, that's what they agree upon. It's become what's called a bedrock fact that Jesus was an exorcist and a healer, at least in the eyes of his contemporaries. And one more key thing about that is when you compare him to all the other figures of antiquity that are reported to have performed miracles, the historical sources for Jesus' life stand out. They're unique. They are solid and authentic enough to make that claim that his contemporaries actually believed he was doing miracles. That's not true in any other case. And all the other figures from antiquity, modern critical biblical scholars dismiss all those reports as being mainly mythological, not based in history. Whereas when they look at Jesus, they say that it is squarely based in history. It's one of the most certain historical data we have about the life of Jesus is that he was known, understood to be, witnessed to be a miracle worker in his day. Now, among those scholars where there's that unanimous consensus, it starts to break down a little bit in terms of how they explain the historical record. So they all agree that the historical record is such that everybody who witnessed Jesus' life thought they were seeing miracles in front of their face. They couldn't deny it. But some scholars won't attempt to go on and explain what actually happened. They won't tell you what they believe actually happened. Other scholars who tend to be of more skeptical nature will say that it's just an anomaly, that it's what he was doing wasn't strictly miraculous. They can't explain it, but they think of it like in terms of indeterminism and quantum mechanics, that there are certain anomalies built into the universe, and they think that these things can be explained that way. And there's others who want to explain it as Jesus being just such a charismatic figure that he actually could manipulate the physical realm somehow. But the majority of those scholars of that unanimous consensus, the majority, a clear majority of them, find no other way to explain the historical record than to admit that there was supernatural power at work in and through Jesus. You are that man. As brilliant as Bill Maher is in pointing out the hypocrisy in our political dynamic these days, and I do think he's brilliant about that, and for the most part, even though he has a partisan position himself, I find him to be very balanced, very incisive in his perspective. As brilliant as he is in doing that, his eyes are completely blind, utterly blind, like David was to his own indefensible position, like the extreme left and the extreme right, as Maher points out, are to their own indefensible position. He is completely blind to how indefensible his position is, his refusal to just take a look at the evidence, to follow the science, because in scholarship, when it comes to historical scholarship, understanding what critical biblical scholars are saying, what the consensus is the way of following the science, seeing what they produce in terms of evidence, explanations, using rigorous logic and historical evidence and historical criteria to talk about why they think something is historical is the data. And the data is as certain as it can be among modern historical biblical scholars that Jesus was a miracle worker. For Maher to just reject that out of hand because of his prior commitments to a worldview, to his atheistic worldview, irrational commitments in this case, because he's not willing to be open-minded and think critically about the evidence that this journalist was trying to share with him that's out there. He showed no curiosity about it, no critical thinking about it. To do that is to take an indefensible position, to be completely blind to how indefensible that position and closed-minded that position is. You are that man. But Bill Maher isn't alone. We are all in that position many times in many places in our lives. We can see oftentimes in the extremes on the political spectrum. We can see it in the example I'm giving of Bill Maher, but so often we, like King David, are blind to the ways that we are thinking or doing or having attitudes or perspectives, things that are completely indefensible. How we have to do mental gymnastics to try to justify ourselves, the position we're taking or the actions that we're doing at the moment. I, for a long time, even when I came to believe in Jesus, rejected the miracles of Jesus, thought of them more the way Maher does, as mythology, as kind of a literary device to express that here in Jesus is found God in human form, who is both displaying the power of God and the love of God. The miracle is the perfect way to do that, to capture that in a kind of as a literary device. The only miracle that mattered to me was the super miracle of his resurrection. If he rose from the dead, then that showed that he was really God incarnate. And when I came to believe that through a lot of examination of the evidence and rigorous logical thinking, when I came to believe that, I didn't need any of the other miracles to be true. In fact, I was very uncomfortable with them. I liked the Jefferson Bible, except for the fact that he cuts the resurrection out. But if he didn't, I would prefer the Jefferson Bible because it seemed much more rational to me. But as I became aware of what was happening in scholarship over the past 30 years, how more and more this consensus was growing until it became almost unanimous about the miracles of Jesus, until I became aware of some of the embarrassing wealth of evidence that scholars were unearthing, the arguments that they were presenting that have become irrefutable, that under peer review, under the harshest of critical review have stood up, that showed, that vindicated that the Gospels, especially the supernatural elements, in particular Jesus' miracles, his exorcisms and miracles, were as solid of history as we can find in an ancient source. That's when I had to challenge my own assumptions. I had to rethink my own assumptions. And it's only because I was forced to think in an open-minded, critical way about this. I was forced to take a good hard look, another good hard look at the evidence for Jesus' miracles, his exorcisms and miracles, that I came to accept what they were saying, which is that there's really no doubt that the people who witnessed Jesus were absolutely convinced that he was doing these supernatural feats, these wonderful, amazing supernatural feats right before their eyes. Even if they believed he was doing them by the power of the devil, they still acknowledged that he was doing these supernatural deeds. And when I acknowledged that, then I had to look at the arguments for what that meant and think critically about what that meant. And it led me to the conclusion that it must mean that Jesus had supernatural power in and through him, that he was acting in that supernatural power of God to do these things. For me, that was the most logical explanation for what was happening. You are that man. In this election season, when we see people holding these indefensible positions, trying to defend indefensible positions, and we can see it so clearly in other people, it's a good time to examine our own blind spots. And one of the key blind spots for many people is the historical record about Jesus. Many people in our culture dismiss it, like Marr does, as pure mythology, as legendary. But if you're really open-minded, if you want to be an open-minded, critically thinking, independent thinking person, then you need to take a good hard look at the evidence that modern critical scholars are presenting. Because there really is no doubt in the historical authenticity of Jesus as a miracle worker. And that's unique in the ancient world. In antiquity, there's no other figure that compares. That's why these same scholars will look at every other miracle worker, reputed miracle worker, as mythology, as the stories about them as mythology. But with Jesus, it's different. And then when you take a good hard look at that, you have to ask the question of what does that mean? What does that imply? Now, you, like some of those other scholars, may conclude that it's just an anomaly or the effect of his charismatic presence, or just not want to explain it at all. But I would suggest to you that the most rational explanation, the simplest explanation, is that the historical record is the way that it is, the data is the way that it is, because God's miraculous power was at work in and through Jesus. If you want to see some of these sources, some of what scholars have produced on the website, I have a page that has some of my recommended resources, and in those it will kind of guide you to the ones that will talk about the miracles, some of the best books written recently that capture some of this scholarship and that can guide you toward the evidence for those miracles. But I encourage you to take an open-minded, critical, independent look at this question, because if Bill Maher is right about one thing, it's that we desperately need, not just in our politics, but in all things, and especially in the ultimate things like the question of God, we need to think in our culture a lot more open-mindedly, a lot more critically, a lot more independently. If you have any comments or questions about this blog or any other, please go to the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave them there. I look forward to hearing from you.